Close your eyes for just a moment. Can you hear the distant ringing of a bicycle bell echoing through a narrow, winding alleyway? Can you smell the faint, smoky scent of burning coal briquettes mingling with the crisp evening air? Welcome back to a time when our pockets were completely empty, but our hearts were overwhelmingly full. Today, we are going to take a slow, gentle journey back to the China of the 1960s, 1970s, and 1980s. We will remember 20 humble, incredibly inexpensive foods that we ate when we had absolutely no money. These were meals born of sheer necessity, crafted with profound love by our mothers and grandmothers in tiny, dimly lit communal kitchens. For the younger generation today, it might seem completely unbelievable that we survived and even thrived on such meager provisions. But for us, these simple flavors are the true, irreplaceable taste of childhood. Please stay with me until the very end, because the final food we will remember is one that carries the most profound memory of a mother's unconditional love, a memory that might just bring a warm tear to your eye. Time seemed to move so much slower back then, did it not? There was no frantic rush, no constant buzzing of mobile screens, no demand for instant gratification. We lived our lives according to the gentle rhythm of the changing seasons and the simple rising and setting of the sun. In those days, everything was strictly rationed by the state. We carried those precious paper grain coupons and oil coupons in our pockets, guarding them like our lives depended on it, because they truly did. It is a very common misconception today that because we lacked modern technology and material wealth, our lives were somehow poorer or more emotionally miserable. But you and I know the absolute truth. Our lives were infinitely richer in the things that truly mattered. We had the incredible luxury of anticipation. We waited all year long for a small taste of meat at the Lunar New Year celebration. We sat closely around the warm coal stove in the harsh, freezing winter, sharing quiet stories, sharing loud laughter, and sharing whatever meager food we had on our plates. The communal courtyards were beautifully alive with deep human connection, filled with neighbors who felt much more like blood relatives. Our bowls may have been half empty, but our souls were entirely full of sincerity, resilience, and quiet gratitude. Let us begin our journey with a memory that surely resides in the hearts of many. The humble bowl of steaming white rice, crowned with a glistening spoonful of pork lard. In the 1970s, cooking oil was strictly rationed, and every single drop of animal fat was treated like liquid gold. Do you remember how your mother would carefully render the pork fat in the heavy iron wok? The communal kitchen would slowly fill with that rich, intoxicating aroma that made your stomach rumble. Once the fat was rendered, the pure snow-white lard was safely stored in a chipped enamel mug. On days when the pantry was bare and meat was a distant memory, a scoop of hot rice was miraculously transformed by just a small dab of this lard. As the heat of the fresh rice melted the solid fat, it seeped into every single grain, coating them in a rich, velvety gloss. A few drops of dark, salty soy sauce were sprinkled on top, creating a symphony of savory flavors. You would hold the warm porcelain bowl in your hands, letting its heat seep into your palms on a freezing winter evening. Every bite was chewed slowly, savoring the profound comfort it brought to a hungry belly. It was a dish born of necessity, an improvisation in times of severe scarcity. Yet the memory of that simple fragrance still holds more warmth than any extravagant banquet we might attend today. We did not know we were poor back then. We only knew that this bowl of rice tasted like pure happiness. Let us now recall the coarse, yellow-steamed cornbread we affectionately called wotu. In those hard decades, fine white wheat flour was an absolute luxury, reserved only for the most important holidays or for visiting guests. Our daily sustenance came from coarse, unforgiving grains. Do you remember the rough, grainy texture of the cornmeal as you swallowed it? It would almost scratch your throat on the way down, a harsh, daily reminder of the difficult times we lived in. Yet, there was a profound artistry in how our tired mothers prepared it. They would mix the bright yellow cornmeal with warm water, kneading it with gentle, experienced hands. Then, using their thumb, they would expertly shape it into a perfect, hollow cone. This hollow center was not merely for decoration. It allowed the hot steam to penetrate the dense dough, cooking it evenly in the large bamboo steamers. When the heavy wooden lid of the steamer was finally lifted, a vast cloud of thick white steam would billow into the cold kitchen, carrying with it a simple, earthy, and slightly sweet aroma. We would eat this coarse bread with a small bite of heavily salted vegetables, filling our growing bellies with the dense, heavy grains that gave us the energy to run and play in the narrow alleyways. Today, wealthy people eat coarse grains for their health, paying high prices in fancy, well-lit restaurants. But for us, the wotu was the heavy anchor of our childhood, a beautiful symbol of endurance. Moving into the sweltering heat of summer, let us remember the brilliance of fried watermelon rind. In the intense summer heat, without the luxury of electric fans or air conditioning, a slice of cold watermelon was a rare blessing. We would eat the sweet red flesh all the way down until we hit the bitter green skin. But in a time when absolutely nothing was ever wasted, our mothers saw potential where others saw garbage. She would take the leftover rinds and carefully use a heavy knife to slice off the hard, dark green outer skin. What remained was the pale, greenish-white flesh of the rind. She would cut this into incredibly thin, uniform strips. With just a single drop of precious oil in the hot iron wok, she would stir-fry these strips with a smashed clove of garlic and a pinch of coarse salt. The transformation was truly magical. The rind lost its raw taste and absorbed the savory garlic, becoming as crisp and refreshing as the finest summer vegetable. It was served as a side dish with our evening porridge, providing a cool, crunchy contrast to the hot meal. This dish was a masterpiece of frugal innovation. It taught us a lesson that we carried for the rest of our lives, the lesson that with a little patience and a lot of care, even the things that seem worthless can be transformed into something deeply nourishing and deeply beautiful. As the bitter winter winds began to howl outside our windows, sweet potato porridge became our daily comfort. When our monthly grain coupons ran dangerously low, rice became a precious commodity that had to be stretched as far as possible. Sweet potatoes, on the other hand, were cheap, plentiful, and easy to store in the dark corners of our small homes. Early in the freezing mornings, grandmother would wash the dirt from the heavy roots, peel away the thick skins, and chop the bright orange flesh into large chunks. She would boil a massive pot of water, adding only a small handful of precious white rice and a mountain of sweet potatoes. As the pot bubbled over the coal stove for hours, the sweet potatoes would begin to melt into the water, turning the broth into a thick, glowing, golden porridge. The natural sugars of the root vegetable infused every single grain of rice with a deep, comforting sweetness. We would sit on low wooden stools, wrapping our cold fingers around the hot porcelain bowls, blowing gently on the steaming surface before taking a cautious sip. It was sweet, it was filling, and it kept the winter chill at bay. Because we ate it almost every single day, many of us grew tired of it back then, dreaming of plain white rice. Yet today, we find ourselves wandering through modern markets, searching in vain for a sweet potato that holds that exact, perfect sweetness of our childhood winters. Do you remember the magical crunch of scorched rice, the precious layer we called guoba? In the era before automatic electric rice cookers, every meal was cooked in a massive, heavy iron wok, set over a fiercely burning wood or coal fire. Controlling the temperature of such a fire was a difficult art. Inevitably, the layer of rice touching the very bottom of the black wok would toast and harden, transforming into a thick, golden brown crust. Today, people might consider it ruined or burnt, but to the children of the 1970s, this was the ultimate prize. After the soft, white rice was carefully scooped out to feed the adults, Mother would take an iron spatula and vigorously scrape the bottom of the wok. The loud, scraping sound was music to our young ears. She would pry loose large, curved shards of this crispy, toasted rice. It had a remarkably complex flavor, deeply toasted, slightly smoky from the coal fire, and rich with the concentrated essence of the grain. Sometimes, if we were incredibly lucky, she would sprinkle a single pinch of salt or a drop of soy sauce over it. We children would divide the pieces fairly, running out into the courtyard to crunch on our prize. It was louder and far more delicious than any packaged potato chip sold today. It was a beautiful reward, born from the very flames that warmed our small homes. Let us take a moment to listen for the loud, thunderous boom of the street popcorn vendor. This was not the popcorn you buy in a colorful cardboard box at a modern cinema. This was a grand, theatrical event. Every few weeks, an old man would wheel a strange, blackened iron contraption into our alleyway. It looked exactly like a small, ancient cannon. The moment we saw him setting up his small coal fire, the neighborhood children would run back to our homes, begging our mothers for a small cup of raw, dried corn or rough rice. We would wait in a long, excited line, clutching our cups. The old man would pour our grain into the heavy iron belly of the cannon, seal it tight, and turn the handle over the hot coals. We watched the small pressure gauge slowly rise. Then the moment of absolute thrill arrived. He would stand up, place a long canvas sack over the opening, and yell a warning. We all pressed our hands tightly over our ears and squeezed our eyes shut. Bang! A massive explosion echoed off the brick walls, followed by a thick cloud of sweet, fragrant white smoke. When the smoke cleared, our tiny handful of hard grain had miraculously expanded into a massive bag of soft, fluffy popcorn. The smell of the coal smoke mixed with the toasted corn was absolutely intoxicating. It was cheap magic, a spectacular show, and a delicious treat all rolled into one beautiful, unforgettable memory. When the harsh winter finally melted into the gentle warmth of spring, it was time to forage for wild shepherd's purse. We called it hikai. In the 1960s and 70s, vegetables in the city markets were expensive and scarce, but nature always offered her quiet bounty to those willing to look. On a sunny Sunday afternoon, mothers and grandmothers would take us children out to the open fields and grassy banks just outside the city limits. Armed with nothing more than small bamboo baskets and tiny iron trowels, we walked for miles. We were taught how to spot the delicate, jagged green leaves of the wild shepherd's purse hiding among the tall weeds. Digging them up from the damp, fragrant earth was a joyful game. Our hands grew stained with dirt and the bright green juices of the plants. Once our baskets were entirely full, we carried our heavy harvest home. The wild greens were washed meticulously in a large enamel basin to remove the field grit, then chopped incredibly fine. Mother would mix this vibrant green bounty with just the tiniest scrap of minced pork fat, wrapping the mixture into delicate dumplings. When you took a bite of those steaming dumplings, the incredibly fresh, grassy, earthy flavor exploded in your mouth. It tasted exactly like the arrival of spring itself, a free gift from the earth that brought immense joy to our frugal tables. As autumn leaves began to fall, the entire neighborhood embarked on the monumental task of making pickled cabbage, the famous swan kai. For families in the northern regions, the long, brutal winter meant that fresh green vegetables would completely vanish for months. To survive, we bought hundreds of pounds of cheap, fresh Chinese cabbage when the harvest came in. The narrow hallways and open courtyards were completely blocked by towering mountains of green and white cabbages, left out to dry slightly in the cool autumn wind. Then began the arduous process of preservation. The cabbages were packed tightly into massive, dark ceramic vats. Coarse salt was heavily sprinkled between the layers, and finally, a large, heavy river stone was placed on top to press the water out. As the weeks passed, a distinct, sharp, sour smell of fermentation would begin to fill the dark hallways of our apartment buildings. It was not a bad smell to us. It was the smell of winter security. Throughout the freezing months, Mother would pull a freezing, dripping cabbage from the vat, wash it, and slice it thin. Stir-fried with dried chilies, or stewed in a hot pot with a few drops of precious oil. The incredibly bright, sour, and savory flavor would instantly awaken our dull winter palates. It was a powerful flavor that made you easily eat 2 extra bowls of rice, a testament to our profound ability to preserve life through the darkest cold. There is a very specific aroma that belongs only to the freezing streets of a 1980s winter, the intoxicating scent of roasted sweet potatoes. Imagine walking home from school, wearing a heavy cotton-padded jacket, the bitter wind biting at your cheeks and nose. Suddenly, you catch that familiar, warm, caramelized smell drifting down the street. You follow it to find an old vendor standing beside a large, modified oil drum, a small coal fire glowing brightly at the bottom. Inside, resting on an iron grate, were large, misshapen sweet potatoes, baking slowly in the intense, dry heat. For just a few tiny fen, a few pennies, you could buy one. The vendor would use heavy iron tongs to pull out a steaming, blackened root. It was so incredibly hot that you had to toss it quickly back and forth between your gloved hands, doing a little dance of joy on the pavement. When you finally broke it in half, a thick cloud of sweet steam rose into the freezing air. The flesh inside was incredibly soft, glowing a brilliant, vibrant orange, and the natural sugars had leaked out and caramelized into a thick, sticky syrup on the charred skin. You ate it standing right there on the street, the profound heat warming your frozen fingers, the immense sweetness melting in your mouth. It was not just a cheap snack. It was a glowing ember of pure comfort against the harsh winter cold. Let us pause to listen for a rhythmic, musical sound that always brought children running, the sharp ding, ding, ding of the maltose candy vendor. We called it Ding Ding Tang. This traveling vendor did not set up a shop. He walked slowly through the winding alleyways, carrying 2 heavy wooden baskets balanced on a bamboo pole across his shoulders. In one basket rested a massive, solid block of dull white candy, covered in a fine layer of white powder. To break off a piece, he used a small metal chisel and a flat iron hammer, striking them together to create that unforgettable ringing sound. Money was scarce, but the vendor was kind. He would accept trade. We children would frantically search our homes and the surrounding streets for anything of value: empty glass bottles, old toothpaste tubes, or scraps of rusted metal. We would proudly hand over our collected treasures, and with a swift crack of his hammer, he would chip off a jagged chunk of the hard candy. As you put it in your mouth, the dusty exterior gave way to an incredibly chewy, deeply sweet malt flavor. It was incredibly sticky, famously pulling at your teeth as you chewed, but the warm, roasted sweetness lasted for an entire afternoon. It was a beautiful lesson in the value of discarded things, turning trash into an unforgettable, long-lasting childhood treasure. We must also remember the difficult times and the harsh reality of eating sorghum rice. In many regions, particularly during the leanest years, fine rice and wheat flour were completely unavailable to ordinary families. We relied heavily on gaoliang, the deep red, coarse grains of sorghum. Before it could even be cooked, it had to be soaked in water for many hours just to soften its tough exterior. Even then, when boiled into a thick red porridge or steamed, it retained a dry, remarkably rough texture. It felt almost like eating sand, scratching the back of your throat as you forced yourself to swallow. Mothers would sometimes try to make it more palatable by mixing it with a small handful of cornmeal or a spoonful of vegetable broth, but there was no hiding the harsh nature of the grain. We children would often complain, chewing slowly and reluctantly. Yet our parents would sternly remind us that this heavy, resilient grain was keeping us alive. We learned to eat it in silence, washing it down with cups of hot, boiled water. Today, the deep red color of sorghum brings back a wave of complex emotions. It reminds us of the undeniable hardships we faced, but also of the incredible, unbreakable endurance of our generation, swallowing the bitterness of life without surrender. Moving from the fields to the trees, let us recall the immense joy of catching and roasting cicadas. In the humid, heavy heat of a midsummer evening, the deafening song of the cicadas would finally fade as darkness fell. This was our signal. Armed with heavy glass jars and weak, flickering flashlights, the neighborhood children would venture out into the shadows. We would shine our lights up the trunks of the old willow and poplar trees, searching for the golden shells of the cicadas emerging from the ground to molt. The thrill of spotting one, slowly climbing the bark, was unmatched. We would carefully pluck them from the trees, dropping them into our jars. We returned home triumphant, our jars vibrating with life. Grandmother would take our catch, rinse them quickly in cold water, and heat the heavy iron wok with only the faintest smear of cooking oil and a generous pinch of coarse sea salt. She would fry the insects until they turned a deep, crispy, golden brown. To a child of today, eating insects might seem absolutely terrifying. But to us, starved for protein and hungry for flavor, it was an absolute feast. They were incredibly crunchy, with a rich, nutty, and distinctly earthy flavor that tasted exactly like the wild heart of a childhood summer. When we speak of comfort, we must speak of a simple bowl of soy sauce noodles. In families where meat was a luxury seen only once or twice a year, a satisfying meal had to be built from flour and ingenuity. Mother would clear the small wooden table, measure out a pile of coarse flour, and add water, kneading the dough with immense strength until it was smooth and elastic. With a heavy wooden rolling pin, she would flatten it out and fold it, using a large cleaver to slice it into thick, uneven, rustic noodles. They were boiled in a massive pot of bubbling water until they floated to the surface. But the true magic lay in the dressing. There was no rich meat ragout, no expensive sauces. Mother would place the hot noodles in a bowl, pour over a spoonful of dark, salty soy sauce, and sprinkle a handful of finely chopped green scallions on top. Then in a small iron ladle, she would heat a tiny amount of cooking oil over the coal fire until it began to smoke. With a swift motion, she poured the smoking oil directly over the raw scallions. The intense sizzling sound, accompanied by the immediate, explosive aroma of the toasted onions and soy sauce, was utterly intoxicating. We slurped those thick, chewy noodles loudly and eagerly, the simple, savory flavors filling our senses and comforting our souls. Let us take a moment to honor the humble cabbage stalk. As we remembered earlier, Chinese cabbage was the undisputed king of the winter diet. The soft, tender, light green leaves were carefully reserved for stir-fries and hot winter stews. But in our homes, the thick, hard, purely white stalks at the base of the vegetable were never, ever thrown away. Mother would carefully separate these tough stalks. Sometimes she would simply wash them thoroughly and hand them to us children to eat completely raw. Believe it or not, the thickest part of the stalk was incredibly crisp, intensely juicy, and carried a subtle, clean sweetness that tasted almost like a mild winter pear. It was our winter fruit, when real fruit was unimaginably expensive. Other times, Mother would take her knife and slice the stalks into thin, uniform matchsticks, tossing them in a bowl with a splash of sharp black vinegar and a tiny pinch of precious white sugar. Left to marinate for an hour, it transformed into a bright, crunchy, refreshing appetizer that awakened the palate. Eating the cabbage stalk taught us a profound philosophy of life, that true value is found in using absolutely everything we are given, and that even the toughest, most discarded parts of life can be made sweet with a little effort. When the Lunar New Year finally arrived, bringing a brief pause to the long winter, it also brought the brilliant red magic of the candied hawthorn stick, the beloved tang hulu. This was the ultimate childhood treat, a rare luxury that cost only a few pennies, but felt like a king's ransom. We would hear the vendor calling out in the alleyway, carrying a tall straw pillar pierced with dozens of these magnificent treats. Large, perfectly round, deep crimson hawthorn berries were carefully threaded onto a long bamboo skewer. The vendor would dip the entire skewer into a bubbling pot of boiling malt sugar and let it cool in the freezing winter air. The sugar would instantly harden into a perfectly clear, glistening, glass-like shell. Holding that heavy stick in your small, mittened hand made you feel incredibly wealthy. The true joy of the tanghulu was in the contrast. First, your teeth would shatter the cold, crunchy, intensely sweet sugar shell. Immediately following the sweet crunch came the sudden, sharp, incredibly sour bite of the soft red berry inside. The mixture of extreme sweet and extreme sour made your mouth water instantly. It was a brilliant, vibrant splash of bright red color and explosive flavor in an otherwise gray, difficult winter world. A memory as sweet and sharp as the candy itself. Breakfast in those days was a simple affair, often built around the cold, leftover steamed buns from the night before. We called them manto. Eating a cold, dense manto was a heavy, joyless task. But human ingenuity always finds a way to bring warmth to the cold. In the dim light of the early morning, before leaving for school or the factory, someone would take a sharp knife and slice the cold buns into thick, even rounds. These white slices were then carefully balanced on the iron rim of the burning coal stove that heated the room. We would stand there, shivering slightly, watching the bread intensely. Slowly, the fierce, dry heat of the iron would toast the surface of the manto. We would carefully flip them, watching as they turned a beautiful, uneven golden brown, the edges becoming slightly charred and smoky. The transformation was miraculous. The outside of the bun became incredibly crispy, shattering like a delicate biscuit when you bit into it, while the inside remained warm, soft, and pillowy. If we were unbelievably lucky, we might rub a tiny sliver of preserved tofu on top, but most often we ate them completely plain. That dry, warm crunch, accompanied by the faint smell of coal smoke, is the defining, comforting flavor of a 1970s morning. If rendering pork lard provided the daily fat for our cooking, then the byproduct of that process provided the most coveted, secret snack of our childhood, the pork crackling, or ju yo cha. After the heavy iron wok had melted away all the pure white fat from the diced pork skin, what remained were tiny, shriveled, golden brown nuggets of pure, concentrated flavor. Mother would scoop these crispy treasures out of the hot oil with a wire skimmer, let them drain, and sprinkle them while still hot with a tiny pinch of coarse salt. Because they were so rich and flavorful, they were rarely served all at once. Instead, they were hidden away in a small glass jar, pushed far back into the darkest corner of the wooden cupboard, saved to flavor a massive pot of winter cabbage. But we children always knew exactly where that jar was hiding. Sometimes, when the kitchen was quiet and Mother was busy washing clothes in the courtyard, we would tiptoe into the room. We would unscrew the metal lid with trembling fingers and steal just one single crackling. You would place it on your tongue and bite down. The intense, explosive crunch, followed by a rush of rich, salty, savory pork flavor, was overwhelming. It was an incredibly guilty, immensely satisfying pleasure, a tiny, stolen moment of absolute culinary luxury, in a world of strict rationing. In an era when modern medicine was scarce and doctors were a luxury, we relied on a different kind of healing. You remember the simple, profound comfort of sugar water, the magical tang shui? When a child fell ill with a sudden winter fever, or came home crying with an upset stomach, there were no brightly colored pills or sweet syrups from a pharmacy. Instead, Mother would boil fresh water in the heavy iron kettle. She would take a clean, chipped enamel cup, the one painted with faded red peonies, and fill it with the boiling water. Then she would open the tightly sealed tin where the precious white granulated sugar was kept. With the utmost care, she would scoop a single, generous spoonful of the sparkling crystals and drop them into the hot water. The rhythmic clinking sound of the metal spoon striking the sides of the enamel cup as she stirred is a sound deeply etched in our memories. She would sit on the edge of the bed, softly blowing on the surface to cool it, before handing it to us. Drinking that warm, deeply sweet liquid felt like swallowing a glowing ember of comfort. It coated the throat and calmed the stomach immediately. We knew, even then, that it was not the sugar that was healing us. It was the physical, undeniable embodiment of a mother's anxious, boundless love. When a major festival finally approached, the entire atmosphere of the communal apartment building would change, marked by the unmistakable, lingering smell of hot oil and the creation of fried dough twists, the beloved mahua. Flour and cooking oil were carefully saved for months to prepare for this joyous occasion. Several families would often pool their precious resources together in the communal kitchen. The mothers would mix a massive mound of wheat flour with water, and sometimes a rare pinch of sugar or a drop of fragrant sesame oil. The magic happened in their experienced hands. They would take small pieces of the smooth dough, roll them into long, thin ropes, and swiftly twist them together into intricate, braided knots. Then these pale dough knots were carefully lowered into a wok filled with deep, bubbling, roaring hot oil. The sound of the intense frying was a song of celebration. The twists would expand and float to the surface, turning a magnificent, deep, golden brown. When they were finally pulled from the oil and cooled, they were incredibly hard and famously crunchy. We children would chew on a single twist for hours, our jaws aching from the effort, but we refused to stop. We savored every single rich, oily, satisfying bite, committing the rare taste of abundance to memory. We have reached our final memory, a dish that holds more quiet sorrow and profound love than any other, the steamed egg custard. In a family of 5 or 6, acquiring a single fresh chicken egg was a rare event. You could not simply scramble it, for it would barely yield a bite for each person. Instead, Mother performed a miracle of stretching. She would crack that single precious egg into a deep porcelain bowl, beating it vigorously with chopsticks until it was pale yellow. Then she added an abundance of warm water, far more water than egg, and a tiny pinch of salt, beating it again until a fine foam appeared. She placed the bowl carefully into the bamboo steamer. Through sheer experience, she knew exactly when to remove it. It emerged transformed, a bowl of delicate, trembling, incredibly fragile golden custard, as smooth and reflective as a polished mirror. She would carefully drop a single tear of fragrant dark sesame oil and a splash of soy sauce on the pristine surface. When she served it, using a small porcelain spoon, she would carefully distribute the trembling custard into the bowls of us children. We would always ask, "Mother, why are you not eating?" And she would always smile her tired smile and say, "I do not like eggs, you children eat." We were young, and we foolishly believed her. Today, looking back through the heavy lens of time, we know the absolute truth. We know the painful depth of the sacrifices she made. We weep for the lies our mothers told us just to fill our bellies, and we honor the boundless, beautiful love poured into that single, watered-down egg. as we open our eyes and return to the fast-paced, brilliantly lit world of today, we realize a profound truth. We do not merely miss the taste of these cheap, simple foods. What we truly miss, with an ache in our hearts, is the beautiful, unhurried era they represent. We miss the vibrant feeling of our resilient youth, the unbreakable, trusting bonds of our large families, the loud, shared warmth of the communal courtyards, and most of all, the strong, gentle mothers who performed daily miracles with completely empty cupboards. Our lives back then were undeniably hard, but they were deeply honest, and they were profoundly beautiful. If this slow journey back in time has warmed your heart and brought a tear of remembrance to your eye, please subscribe to our channel and like this video so we can continue to preserve these precious, fading memories together. Now, I want to ask you an important question. Which of these 20 humble foods brought back the strongest, most vivid memory for you? Or is there another long-lost dish from your own childhood that you still dream about on a cold night? Please take a moment to share your personal story in the comments below. We would be deeply honored to read it.